So we move on to Mark chapter 8, verses 27 to 30. This has often been termed as the watershed of Mark's gospel. It is to this part that everything leads, and from this part that everything takes off. And so Jesus is in the villages of Caesarea Philippi. This was formerly known as Paneas or Panion, and Herod Philip had enlarged it and named it after Caesar and himself, and that is why Caesarea Philippi. The place seems to indicate this emperorship, leadership, etc. So Mark possibly has this place also as the background about what exactly true authority means. Notice, only in Mark are we told on the way. So in the villages of Caesarea Philippi, but on the way, Jesus asks his disciples the question about who people say he is. And we notice the answers which are given are the answers which were given in chapter 6, when Herod was wondering about who Jesus was. So Herod's answer matches partly with this answer of people, namely John the Baptist, others Elijah. Now in Ecclesiasticus, or the book of Sirach, Elijah is extolled to the heavens. So therefore, others say Elijah, because Elijah was regarded as a very powerful prophet. Elijah was regarded as someone who would come before God according to Malachi. And that is why it was not really strange that people could think that Jesus was Elijah, because of the power that Jesus also was showing. And one of the prophets in Deuteronomy, Moses promised the people that God would send a prophet, also a prophet like himself. So the word prophet here would be regarded as a prophet along the lines of Moses. So these answers already indicate that Jesus was extremely, extremely effective in his reaching out. So he was already put at the level of those who really were regarded in the society of that time. But we know that Jesus cannot merely be John the Baptist, nor can he be Elijah, nor can he be one of the prophets. So the disciples are asked, notice, not only Peter, but the disciples, but you, actually the translation ought to be, but you, who do you say that I am? So it must be translated twice, the word you, but you, who do you say I am? So in other words, Jesus is asking for an assessment of how he has reached out to them. So in a way, Jesus is appearing for an examination. It is not the students who appear for the examination, but the one who teaches. And so here Jesus is now appearing for that examination. And the answer will depend on whether Jesus has passed or failed. But you, who do you say I am? And Peter answers, you are the Messiah. That is the Hebrew word for the Greek Christos and the English anointed one. In the Gospel of Matthew, Peter's answer is, you are the Christ, or the Messiah, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. So Peter's answer in Matthew is more explicit, and even in Luke, you are the Christ of God. You are the anointed one of God, because we saw in Psalm chapter 2 verse 7 that even kings were called anointed ones. The kings were anointed when they reached the throne. So Peter's answer in Mark is that you are the Christ, or you are the Messiah, or you are the anointed one, is not explicated. However, on the surface level, Jesus knows that he is the Christ. And so he takes for granted, because he wants to give the benefit of the doubt to the disciples, he takes for granted that Peter has understood. However, because he is not 100% sure and he will still test them, he orders them not to tell anyone, because it is likely that Peter and therefore the disciples may have understood. And so Jesus orders them, the entire group, not to tell anyone about it. This is the first time that the command to silence is given very specifically about his identity. Now, we go back to why did Jesus heal this blind man in 2 stages when he can heal Bartimaeus immediately and without external methods. We can relate the first stage where the blind man sees people, but they look like trees, and only Mark has this connection to the answer which the people make of who Jesus is: John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the prophets. In the second stage, he saw everything clearly, can be compared with "you are the Christ." And so this second healing miracle where Jesus uses external methods seems to be because Mark wants to link it up with the 2 questions which Jesus asks and with the 2 responses which are given about the identity of Jesus. So now, do we conclude, therefore, that because the man saw clearly after the second intervention of Jesus, that the disciples will see clearly? Mark leaves us in suspense about that answer. We cannot really answer it. We will be able to find some insight in the section of the way. A healing of blindness in sight begins the section of the way, and a healing of blindness in sight concludes the section of the way. The section of the way, the Hodos, is basically made up of 3 chapters as far as Mark is concerned. So a miracle of blindness in sight begins the section of the way, and a healing of blindness in sight concludes the section of the way. This section may be seen to be divided into 3 chapters. The first is 8:31, the second begins at 9:31, and the 10 at 10:32. How are these 3 chapters divided? According to the 3 passion and resurrection predictions. They are in 8:31, 9:31, 10:32 to 34. Immediately after every of the passion and resurrection predictions, there is a misunderstanding. In the first case, it is Peter. In the second case, it is all the disciples. In the third case, it is James and John on the surface level, but also the other 10. Because they misunderstand, Jesus has got to teach them explication, explanation, making clear, clarifying about what exactly discipleship means. And then he provides them with a reinforcement about his teaching. So in Mark chapter 8, which begins our first chapter, Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man, very clearly, that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering. Remember this? We come across this term, Son of Man, now after chapter 2, verse 28. You might remember, in chapter 2, verse 10 and chapter 2, verse 28, only twice in the first section, before the section of the way, does Mark use this term, Son of Man. In the first time he used it in chapter 2, verse 10, the Son of Man had authority on earth to forgive sins. In 2:28, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Here, we are told that Jesus began to teach them. So it is only the beginning. In other words, Mark is going to show that Jesus will continuously teach his disciples. The Son of Man must, the first time now, the Son of Man is used in the sense of suffering. What does the word must indicate? Must is translated as the Greek dei, and dei is what is known as a theological passive. That means God ordains. And because Jesus has accepted the invitation which he did after his baptism, when he went into the wilderness and overcame temptations, and when he came into Galilee proclaiming the good news of God, because Jesus has accepted it, it is not a force, it is not coercion, it is not pressure, but the acceptance freely by Jesus, even though it is always God who is in charge. And that's why Jesus uses this phrase, or the term rather, must be. And by whom will the Son of Man be rejected? By basically the religious leaders of this time. And very clearly, Jesus says all this openly. So he says, and after 3 days, he will rise again. Mark almost always uses the active verb. Matthew and Luke have will be raised. Now, the use of the active verb here, after 3 days, rise again, on the surface level, it shows that the initiative is still with Jesus. So Jesus will rise, not the Father will raise Jesus, not God will raise Jesus. However, on the deeper level, it shows the faith once again of Jesus. That Jesus can talk so confidently that he will rise, not because he wants to boast, but because he has got confidence in the Father. And that confidence is seen when we are told that the Son of Man must. So must is indicative of the fact that Jesus has not forgotten that God is in control. And because he has such deep faith, he is able to say that he will rise again. And very clearly, for the first time, he says all this openly. Now, what does openly mean? Openly means not in parables. If earlier on he spoke in parables, which means that it was dialogical, you could interpret it as you want. My teaching is a free teaching. Here, openly must be interpreted as opposite of parables, which means now there is no other way. Now you have to accept what I'm saying if you want to continue to be my disciple. And because it is said so openly, Peter takes him aside. Notice, on 2 occasions, that is, the deaf man with an impediment in his speech, the blind man, Jesus took him by the hand and put him aside. So Mark uses the same thing here, as if Peter is telling Jesus, come on, I'm taking you aside because I want to heal you. I want to talk with you in private. I don't want the others to know something is wrong with you. So Mark, by telling us, Peter took him aside and notice, began to rebuke him, as if Peter is exorcising from Jesus a demon which he believes Jesus is possessed with. Epitimao is the same verb which has been used earlier, which Mark uses here to tell us that Peter rebuked him. Epitimao tell us that Jesus, according to Peter, seems to have a demon in him. And notice the teaching of Jesus is not only for Peter. As far as Jesus is concerned, it is not only Peter, but also the other disciples. Because notice, he turns and looks at his disciples. But he rebukes Peter because Peter tried to take him aside. And he's telling Peter first, again on the surface level, you don't be the leader. You are the follower, so get behind me. Second, the use of Satan basically is not so much to call Peter a devil, but to tell Peter that you are not on the side of human beings, you are on the side, or you're on the side of God, you are on the side of human beings. So by Jesus explains the term Satan, something that Jesus was very harsh. No, very clearly, God's will is primary. And so, if Peter is called Satan, it must be interpreted in the sense of opposite of God. Because Jesus explains then, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. So anyone, when they are comparing with God, if you have to make a choice between the kingdom of God, and if you don't make a choice for the kingdom of God, it's very likely you're making a choice for the kingdom of Satan. And that's why Jesus calls Peter Satan. So know very clearly as far as Jesus is concerned, because he has accepted the invitation, there is no other way. I would like your minds to go back to what I said to you at the scene of the baptism. The voice from heaven spoke at the baptism. Psalm 2 verse 7, Isaiah 42 verse 1. The voice invited Jesus to be king's servant, to be servant king, to be king who becomes king by being servant, to be king who becomes king only by being servant. There is no other way. That's why Jesus says the Son of Man must suffer. And because there is this misunderstanding on the part of Peter here and also the other disciples whom Jesus looks at, Jesus now calls the crowd to him. So it is not only now the disciples who are going to be given a lesson, but also the crowd or anyone who wants to be a disciple. Calling is an indication that there is some important lesson which Jesus is now going to communicate. He called to him on the mountain those whom he wanted. In many cases, there are people who, in the interpretation of this verse 8:34, focus more on the cross than on what Jesus says before the cross. Jesus is not inviting the crowd or anyone who wants to follow him to first take up the cross. No, he is inviting them to first deny themselves. If you look at the manner in which Mark has narrated it, it seems, as far as Mark is concerned, to have a chronological order. So first, a person has to deny. It is only after a person denies him or herself that the person can then think of taking up the cross. Because if a person takes up the cross after denying, there is no cross. Luke, of course, will interpret this slightly differently when he says, take up your cross daily. So referring to the challenges of life which come about our way when we are striving for the truth on a daily basis. So Luke mentions, take up your cross daily. So as far as Jesus is concerned, an individual who wants to follow him has to do this, take up the cross. And taking up the cross will mean striving for life, striving for the Lord, and striving for the gospel. Because when you compare the kingdom of God with the kingdom of Satan, you realize that you may have everything. And if you forfeit your life, then nothing remains. There was a man who was held at gunpoint and told, your money or your life. He said, you better take my life because I'll need my money for my old age. This is how some people think. But if your life is taken, where is the question of old age? So when Jesus talks about this, he says, you cannot give anything in exchange for your life. In Luke chapter 12, Luke tells us the parable of the rich fool. The fool who wants to build bigger barns and bigger barns because his fields are giving him such enormous amount of crops. And Jesus calls him a fool because he is told, you fool, this night your soul is required of you. And in the book of Proverbs, we are told, the fool says in his heart or her heart, there is no God. The fool. So in other words, a foolish person who makes him or herself, or who makes the property or the possessions that they have God. And so Jesus very clearly, what can you give in return for your life? And the question of being ashamed is a question of not standing for Jesus, of denying oneself. If one cannot deny oneself, if one puts the I in the center, then one has sinned. My explanation of sin is very simple, even if not simplistic. I look at the word sin as it is written in the English language. And I notice that there are 3 alphabets in the word sin. The first is S on the one extreme. The other is N on the other extreme. And the I is in the center. However, we notice that even as Jesus speaks about his suffering, he speaks about his return. And the reason why he can do this is because he has faith. The last verse of this pericope, where Jesus says, truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death. What does Jesus mean that they will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God come with power? There are some who think that the reference is to Enoch, Elijah, and Moses. Some standing here. The coming of the kingdom is as certain as the immortality. In Jewish tradition, even though Moses died and was buried, his burial place was not known. Elijah was taken up in a chariot of fire, and Enoch never died. He was with God. So these 3 figures in Jewish tradition were considered as figures who lived immortally. Even if Moses died, because his burial place was not known, it was taken for granted that he was living with God. And so these were considered immortal. So what Jesus is saying here, just as Enoch, Elijah, and Moses are considered immortal, so the kingdom of God is surely going to come. Others refer to this. There are some standing here, namely Peter, James, and John, whom Jesus will take with him to the mountain of transfiguration. They will see the kingdom come with power when they see me transfigured. Others say there are some standing here who will not taste death until the kingdom comes, refers to the resurrection. However, most like to interpret this not as a single event to which Jesus seemed to be referring, but to every event which occurs. The kingdom of God will come when Jesus goes to his death courageously on the cross, and when the veil of the temple is torn and the centurion proclaims him as Son of God. And so, therefore, the reinforcement is given by Jesus in the next scene when he takes the disciples to the mountain of transfiguration. 6 days later, links up this with chapter 9, verse 1. So, therefore, that's why many see in the transfiguration the promise of Jesus. That means these will see the kingdom come in power, and so interpret the transfiguration already as an anticipation of the resurrection. The mention of Moses is also because possibly of Mount Sinai. And so what happens is here, he takes with him for the second time. The first time he took them in chapter 5 when he went in to raise Jairus' daughter in verses 35 to 43. In verse 37 to be exact, Peter, James, and John were taken for the first time. Here, they are taken for the second time. And they are taken to this mountain, which is not named, and very likely because Mark does not want us to get caught up with the mountain, but to realize it or to regard it as a theological topos, as a place in which revelation will take place. And it is on this mountain that the clothes of Jesus are changed, become dazzlingly white, and he is transfigured. So it is Jesus who is transfigured, and also his clothes become white. So it is not only the clothes which become white, but metamorphosis. Metamorphosis is basically the transfiguration of the Lord himself, not merely the external appearance. And then very clearly, who are the ones who appear with him? And there are a variety of interpretations to the two figures, and some say the two figures are representing the law, Torah, and the prophets, Elijah. But Elijah is never regarded as the epitome of prophet, or never regarded as subsuming all the prophets in tradition. He was regarded as an extraordinary prophet, but never as subsuming all the prophets in his own vocation as a prophet. The law could be regarded and could be identified with Moses. So the law and prophet is least varied. Very clearly here, notice, Elijah is mentioned first. Mark alone mentions Elijah with Moses. Matthew and Luke thought possibly that Mark had made a mistake in his chronology, because Moses was before Elijah, and according to them, the law came before the prophet, and so possibly they thought this way and they put Moses and Elijah. However, Mark seems to very, very deliberately have given more importance to Elijah than Moses, because Elijah is the one who would go before the Lord. Elijah is the one who would go as the messenger, Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. Also, the fact that Mark went through such great lengths to show and describe the preaching of John the Baptist, which resembled Elijah, the food and the dress, which resembled Elijah. So for him, Elijah was more important than Moses. Why? Because Jesus is the most important, and Elijah, as the messenger who would go before, would lead to Jesus. And that's why he has got Elijah and Moses, though later on he will mention Moses and Elijah, but he wants the antenna of the reader to go up when they say, hey, has Mark made a mistake by mentioning Elijah before Moses? And his answer would be, no, I have deliberately done so, so that your eyes will be open when you are interpreting my text. These were talking with Jesus. And even though Mark does not give us the content of the discussion, it seems to be that they were talking, according to Luke more clearly than Mark, about what he would accomplish in Jerusalem, so very likely about the death. Peter, of course, does not know how to respond. And so the offer of 3 is for the 3 who are there, not for them to share, but for Moses, Elijah, and also for the Lord. Possibly interpreted as that he wants to remain there and he wants to build a shrine or some ritual observance. Jesus, of course, will not allow that, because what exactly the event is, how the event is to be interpreted, is mentioned by the cloud that overshadowed them. And here, the voice does not issue an invitation. The voice confirms the invitation which Jesus has accepted. Jesus showed in the first passion prediction that he had accepted the invitation when he said the Son of Man must suffer. That is the theological passive Dei. Here, the voice confirms that Jesus has accepted the invitation, and that is why does not invite Jesus again, but like the voice at Matthew's baptism scene, points Jesus out as the Son and the Beloved. And now, because the acceptance of the invitation is not to say once again, in you I am well pleased, no, but giving the 3 and through them the other disciples when they come down, the command to listen to him. The word listening has to be interpreted not so much in the sense of external listening, but accept what he is saying. It's difficult to understand for the disciples. They would want to object to it again and again, but they are invited to listen to it. The disciples, therefore, are not to focus on Elijah. They're not to focus on Moses. Those are only the ones who will come before. They are to focus only on the Lord. The first time, the disciples are given a time limit to the command to silence, and now, after this, there will be no command to silence, and that this is the only time when they are given a time limit is an indication that there is a connection between the command to silence and between the rising from the dead. And what is the connection? The connection is the death which must take place before the rising from the dead. And before the death takes place, there is the suffering, there is the rejection, there is the being spit upon. All that is part of the command to silence. And that is what we can say now in a summary form before we come to the end of the gospel, where the command becomes clearer. So therefore, the glory of the Lord should not be misunderstood. If Peter imagines that the resurrection can come before the death, if the other disciples imagine the same, then they are mistaken. And that's why. Talk about the event of the transfiguration, yes, but only as a prefiguring of the resurrection, but not until the death has taken place. Why? Until after the Son of Man had risen, because the Son of Man will rise only after the death would take place. And the disciples obviously are not able to understand this. They begin to question what it means. And then, once again, notice the reason why Mark has put Elijah and Moses, because the question of Elijah coming first was a very, very, very important question. And Malachi very clearly had not only said that a messenger would be sent, but Malachi had named the Messiah. And then Jesus speaks about Elijah having come. And because Elijah came and was very clearly manifested in John the Baptist, the Son of Man will also go through the same way. So I tell you, Elijah has indeed come. and Elijah, because represented by John the Baptist, and because he's the messenger who goes before the Messiah, very clearly is an indication that the Messiah also has come. This scene might serve once again as the final scene in the confirmation of what Jesus means when he talks about faith and when he talks about prayer. When Jesus comes down from the mountain with the three disciples, he sees crowds, scribes actually, arguing with the disciples and the others who are down. And then a whole crowd. Mark narrates this miracle very, very unruly manner. And Matthew has the same miracle in his gospel, and Matthew very beautifully changes and removes all the duplications of Mark. Because we see in Mark, the crowd comes running to Jesus twice and so many other duplications. It seems that Mark has put two miracles together as a matter of fact when you read this miracle in Mark. However, the point which Mark is making by bringing this miracle after they come down from the mountain is once again to give the disciples a lesson in prayer. So the whole crowd comes to meet Jesus, and so therefore Jesus' fame and power are what attracts the crowd. The Mark in Jesus needs to ask questions, and so he asks what exactly is the problem and why is this argument taking place. The man whose son was affected by epilepsy, because that's how those symptoms described are, he speaks about it, and he also says that he asked the disciples to cast it out, but they could not do so. And notice, the disciples, when they came and returned from mission, Mark chapter 6, verses 30 to 34, had told Jesus all that they had did and said. It seems, even though Mark does not say it explicitly, that there they remembered that they went with the authority of Jesus. Now, it's likely that they have forgotten Jesus and tried to act on their own. This is why they could not cure it. Jesus, of course, responds. Notice the word faithless is an indication of how much faith can accomplish, how much faith is required. In chapter 11, verses 25 to 22 to 25, Jesus will explicate and give a definition of faith there. Here, he simply calls this generation a faithless generation, and this generation, therefore, includes his disciples. So the Spirit sees the Lord, and like the spirits have done earlier on, 1:23 to 28, 5:1 to 20, realizes that it has met its master. The question here by Jesus is to indicate how challenging this situation is, and in a possible sense, though Mark may not have intended to allow the disciples a little leeway. This is too difficult for them to manage because this person has been ill from childhood. We might remember that the woman was ill for 12 years. She had gone to many physicians. She has spent, so those are indications that it is going to be a challenge. And yet, it's not a challenge for Jesus. However, the Father, and understandably so, puts what seems to be a block. You notice? He puts a block, he puts an obstacle. If you are able, unlike the leper who speaks, if you will, because if it is your will. Notice Jesus responds like he does with the leper who responds with faith. He responds with faith. With the Father who responds with the block, Jesus also invites him to go beyond the block. And once again, faith. And this prayer, which is made by the Father, is a prayer which I think is extraordinary. And all of us really can recite this prayer. All of us are in the same boat as the father of the boy. We believe, help our unbelief. There is no new need here for any external method. It is simply a command, and the command never entered him again to show the total healing of the boy. Earlier on, the girl was commanded to be given something to eat. Here, the evil spirit will convulse the boy terribly, that he will be dead, seeming like dead, like a corpse, and Jesus will take him by the hand and lift him up, seeming resurrection terminology. And then, of course, when he enters the house, because the question that the disciples ask are often privately when he enters the house, why could we not cast it out? Here, prayer ought to be defined as trusting in God. And so Jesus is very, very clear that if they have to be able to cast out a demon, they have to be able also to believe that before they can do it, it would be done and it would be theirs. So in a very summary form, the first chapter of our section of the way has got the first passion and resurrection prediction, followed by a misunderstanding by Peter. There is then a teaching on discipleship, which can be summarized in 3 phrases. First, deny yourself, take up the cross and follow. And then is the reinforcement, which is done first through the transfiguration, the question of Elijah coming first, and the healing of the epileptic boy.